Hey, thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate the support. I'm Michael Lieberman, food and beverage practice leader at Foa Son Insurance Brokers. And this is episode 2 of Food for Thought, a monthly podcast where we tackle a different risk management topic, really focusing on the food and beverage industry. As I said last time, I would love to hear from folks out there with any suggestions on future topics. After episode 1, we did get quite a few suggestions, so I really appreciate that, and we're going to develop that content for some future episodes. But today we're talking cyber crime. Cyber crime is absolutely on the rise. The impacts are being felt across the food and beverage industry, amongst other industries, of course. It is estimated that in 2021, cyber losses are going to amount to $6 trillion. Just to put that in context, in 2015, global losses were $3 trillion. So cybercrime is absolutely on the rise and something to pay attention to. Today, I'm here with a good friend and partner, Matthew Sabino. Matt, say hi for everyone. Just make sure your audio is working, your video.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. Looking forward to this.
All right. Well, Matt, thanks for being our guest today. Matt is with ARC Excess and Surplus. They are a wholesale brokerage and a true partner to Foa Son when it comes to the placement of unique coverages like cyber risk insurance. So I'm really happy to have Matt on today to get kind of tap into his expertise. So just the other day, Matt and we did a pre-recorded discussion. We're going to get to that discussion here shortly. But what I would ask is for everyone to stay tuned after that pre-recorded discussion. Matt and we're going to come back. We're going to do a live Q&A. We have Patty Devine here today. Patty, can you say hello for everyone?
Hello, everyone.
All right. So Patty is going to be monitoring the questions that come in. If at any point you, as the viewer of our recorded discussion, have a question that comes to mind, you can just use the Q&A tool on Zoom to enter that question. Patty's going to be monitoring the questions that come in, and she'll be moderating the Q&A session after the pre-recorded discussion. So I think that's all the housekeeping notes for now. Sit back, relax, and please enjoy episode 2 of Food for Thought. No food and beverage business, large or small, is totally isolated from cyber risks. Not a week goes by that we don't read in the news about some major ransomware attack or cyber breach. Because of all of this activity, there's a surge of insurance offerings to protect companies from cyber liabilities. However, due to increased claim activity, in addition to COVID-19 complications, we find ourselves in very harsh insurance market conditions. How can you best navigate the market conditions we find ourselves in today? I'm Michael Lieberman, food and beverage practice leader at Foa Son Insurance Brokers, and this is Food for Thought. Before I begin, a very special shout out to the team over at Fresh Direct. We had a special gift in mind for our guest today, and Fresh Direct helped deliver that gift. You'll see the presentation a little later on during our broadcast. Again, thank you so much to the team over at Fresh Direct. I'm very pleased to welcome today's guest to Food for Thought, Matthew Sabino. Matthew is a licensed broker with ARC Excess and Surplus, a wholesale broker specializing in management and professional lines of coverage, including directors and officers, employment practices, and cyber liability, which will be the focus of today's conversation. ARC Excess and Surplus is a partner of Foa Sons and was established in 1986 to meet the growing needs of small to medium-sized businesses, as well as large corporations seeking management and professional liability insurance solutions. Thank you, Matt, so much for being a guest on Food for Thought. So Matt, I want to jump right into our conversation. Now, you and we work together, often. Our firms, ARC and Foa Son, work together, all the time on putting together cyber insurance. And before I just jump into insurance heavy topics, I always like to paint the picture for my audience, for my clients, my prospective clients, on what cyber risks look like. We know they come in different forms, shapes, sizes, and we'll get to that. But I do think it's really important because, like I said, we work so closely together, and we are just seeing a drastic change in the cyber insurance marketplace. And you and I, we both know that that change is because of the uptick in all of the losses that insurance companies are now paying out that are cyber related. So before we kind of get started here, what I'd like to ask you to do is kind of just frame why are things so bad right now, right? Why is the market so bad? So if you could just give some insight on that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, Michael, and I appreciate the time. Looking forward to this for sure. Not a week goes by where I don't get some sort of a call from a current client or a prospective client about cyber insurance and asking about it. Because let's face it, you open up the paper, you go online, you see activity in ransomware, avenues, coming in each and every day. Not a week goes by where you don't have that exposure kind of percolating in the press. And, when you talk to some of the insurance carriers, you see the differences year over year in the current environment that we're in. I mean, a coalition, for example, which is an insurance carrier that mostly goes after small to medium-sized enterprises, they're seeing a 47% increase in ransomware activity in Q2 2020, and that was already on top of a 100% increase from 2019. The data's out there. These guys put out reports, on a quarterly basis where they show the increase in the activity. 35% of the increase in funds transfer activity, funds transfer fraud, social engineering fraud, increasing from last year. You have ransomware activity up 41%. That's Beasley saying this. So another insurance carrier. It's not just hitting one carrier, it's across the board. The average ransomware payment, now is in the neighborhood of $185,000 and $200,000. These cyber criminals, this is a business enterprise. These people go to work every day. They kiss their wives and their children, and they go to work, and this is what they do. They're in the business of making money, and it's working. This current environment. I read a report the other day. This is wild. So Black Fog, which is a research firm that kind of gathers a lot of this information, they said by 2021, there is an expectation that there's going to be a ransomware or attempted ransomware attack every 11 seconds. And the numbers by 2021 are roughly $20 billion in potential payouts and damages. Now, keep in mind, 2018 was 8.6 billion in the same study, and 2019 was 11.5 billion. So these numbers, they keep on staggering up because these people are getting away with it. It's wild.
So Matt, I mean, those are some staggering and scary statistics. But how about some insight into why these things are happening? Like, why are they happening at a more frequent clip?
A lot of it boils down. I have this comic that I put into presentations when I meet with insureds or when I flip over to prospective clients. It was a boxing ring. And the announcer's in the middle, he's going through his whole spiel, and he's saying, in this corner, we have antivirus protection, firewalls, anti-malware, everything that you would want. And in this corner, we have Dave. And listen, no offense to Dave.
No offense to Dave, right. We love Daves.
It's, in this day and age, cyber criminals and hackers are, they want someone to mess up. They want someone to click on an attachment that isn't kosher. They want someone to, click on a link that's not secure. And there's certain training that can be put into place. But at the end of the day, if someone's in a rush, or in the circumstances that we're currently living in where, let's face it, people are working remotely. People are working at home. There's a lot going on. There's, you're trying to educate your kids while at the same time doing your job. And a lot of the controls that were in place prior to, the COVID pandemic hitting, people do their jobs, but let's face it, when you're working remotely, you're more susceptible to just clicking on something, because a lot of face-to-face communication used to happen and authentication, to the extent, let's just say you have invoices manipulation, right? Someone sends you a fraudulent invoice. Historically, you can maybe walk down the hall and talk to your accounting supervisor to make sure that everything looks okay. Now, maybe you send a quick email. maybe you call, maybe you say, oh, forget it, it's all right. I'm gonna move ahead with processing this. These are all things that the hackers look to take advantage of. This transition to remote work, not only did, let's face it, when COVID hit, a lot of companies weren't set up to work remotely in the extremes that we're currently faced with. They had to get people up and running, through opening, ports, remote desktop protocols, all these things that may not have been put in place prior to COVID was now a rush job because corporations needed to do this in order to survive. It was crucial to their business plan.
So I'm taking some notes here as you're walking through these things. What I'm hearing is the reason for frequency going up, transition to remote work. We're seeing more email intrusion and manipulation.
Yep.
And I wrote here human error,
yeah,
which is really becoming more prominent now that you have employees working from home and not being able to go down the hallway and meet with fellow staff members to authenticate documents.
100%. It's becoming wild. I mean, the U.S. Department of Treasury actually just released recently, a memorandum which states that they don't want businesses paying ransomwares anymore because these criminals are getting so much money from the ransomware activity that they're just continuing to do it. They're going to continue to process these activities, and they're going to go and target new enterprises, new businesses. It doesn't matter if it's hospitals, schools, financial institutions. They're targeting food distributors, whether it be on the wholesale side, the retail side. It doesn't matter. Any business they're targeting.
Yeah, and that's a pretty scary proposition when you hear the government saying we don't want you to pay these ransomwares.
Yeah.
When it's really your business that's at stake here, right? If you have someone saying, hey, we're not going to release access to your systems unless you pay us this ransom, it's very hard for a business owner to not comply with that. If it means their
100%.
business is at risk of massive financial destruction.
If you're a corporation, you're going to want to get your systems back up and running as soon as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to pay the ransom and receive the decryption key. That's ultimately what it comes down to from your standpoint, because at the end of the day, you want to minimize as much damage to your corporation as possible.
So Matt, I mentioned previously that I like to paint the picture for the audience as far as understanding the different shapes and kinds of cyber losses that are out there. One specific thing that we've been talking about is ransomware. And for those who may not know exactly what that means, ransomware is when a malicious party or malicious software, right, gains access to someone's system, blocking the users of that system from accessing the system. There's then a ransom that is asked for the victim to pay in order to get a decryption code to regain access to their own system. Now, there have been some pretty well-known ransomware events that just by mentioning these names, those in the audience may be familiar with them. One that comes to mind is WannaCry, and the other is Petya. So I know that you've had experience with both of these very well-known events. Can you just shed some insight on those two events for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those two are perfect examples of the headlines that are associated with ransomware. When you have WannaCry, you're talking about, on a global scale, $4 billion worth of damages, impacting over $200,000 and, 200,000 business enterprises. These are staggering numbers, and Petya, you're talking about close to $10 billion in damages that were associated with that. And then, the cyber criminals are smart because they take Petya. When that starts to get figured out, they roll out NotPetya. They take it to the next level. These people are very sophisticated. Like I mentioned previously, these are not just, a couple guys sitting in a basement somewhere. They are a business enterprise, and they are very sophisticated in their means and ways of getting into your systems and infiltrating your systems through these ransomware, software and malicious software.
So Matt, as you know, this is Foa Son's Food for Thought, a dedicated podcast for the food and beverage industry. So it would be really helpful to kind of put this and frame this topic, this cyber risk, specifically we're talking about ransomware right now. It'd be very helpful if you could kind of just frame some scenarios that you're familiar with that happen to food and or beverage companies.
Yep. No, not naming any names, but I had a client about a year and a half ago, I believe it was, in the food industry. They were a wholesale distributor of food products. They received an external email from what appeared to be a true vendor counterparty that they did business with. Ultimately, it turns out the email was coming from a malicious third party, replicating the email address, had an embedded PDF in there that made it through the firewall. Ultimately, an employee in the accounting department clicked on that, and they were in. They were in. It wasn't an instantaneous issue, but the bad actors were in the system for a period of time. They gathered intelligence. They accumulated information. They were able to offload information pertaining to files, corporate confidential information, invoice numbers, things to that regard. And ultimately, that's when they sprung their attack. They brought their ransomware demand to the tune of $1.5 million. Now, immediately upon receipt of that, upon learning about the ransomware activity, them being in the system, they reach out to us. We go through the process, but ultimately, it's already happened. The die is cast. It's to the point where now, to get your systems back up and running, you need to bring in, the forensic analysis firms that need to, decide, and decipher where this intrusion happened, how to mitigate it any further, and how to get the ransom paid so you could ultimately get the decryption key to get your systems back up and running. Systematic.
And sorry to interrupt, but while we haven't really talked specific about the insurance coverage that's out there for these types of exposures, you brought up the fact that these forensic firms come in to assist the victims in these situations, and that's a huge benefit of having this type of coverage in place.
Absolutely, 100%. One thing to add about that ransomware activity and what made it so paramount to get their systems back up and running was that the malicious software was impacting their invoicing system and their processing system. So they were unable to take in processing orders. They were unable to invoice, the orders that they had already out the door. This is a company's bread and butter. This is how they survive. And when their systems are down, they want to get things paid as quickly as possible.
Yeah, let's face it. I mean, you have food and beverage companies who have inventory that's scattered all across the country in different third-party warehouses. And if your system goes down, you don't even know sometimes where your inventory is located in order to sell that inventory. So yes, it can be very crippling when these things happen.
You're spot on. And something is actually a new feature of ransomware is that it's the fact that now they're taking the data and they're potentially saying that they're going to expose the data and make it public. Historically they took the ransom and they walked away. Now you're ultimately running at the thought and the fear that your corporate confidential information or your counterparty's information is now going to be exposed, and the PR exposure that goes hand in hand with that is going to really hit your business above and beyond what's going on right now between COVID, between being down for a couple days. Ultimately things got sorted out under this example that I gave, but they were down for a period of time. The insurance carrier kicked in and it saved them $1 million by having the coverage in place, quite honestly.
Right. So Matt, just putting ransomware to the side for the moment and focusing on a different cyber risk. One thing that I have witnessed, my clients have witnessed, and I would call the more frequent cause of cyber loss is what the insurance industry refers to as social engineering. I like to really refer to this as trickery, right? It's when someone at a food and beverage company, let's say the CFO, they receive an invoice from one of their vendors, one of their suppliers, maybe a foreign supplier, domestic supplier. That email references a specific bill of lading, a specific commercial invoice, but there's a different routing number, right? There's a different routing number to send those funds to. And looking at the email, it looks authentic. It has the appropriate documents attached to that email. it is, again, it's trickery. It's these criminals who are gaining access to a system, understanding how the communication flow happens, and then, food and beverage companies are wiring funds to criminals, thinking that they're paying legitimate expenses to their vendors. So can you give some insight into some food and beverage scenarios that you've been part of?
Absolutely, and I mean, this is a loss leader. I mean, this is something that hits on a monthly basis when it comes to social engineering, and I'm glad you brought up the point about the fact that through the ransomware activities, these actors are in the system, so they learn how the systems work. They can take notes. They realize how invoices get paid and how who communicates with who. So it's interesting that you brought up a CFO receiving an invoice, because that was the circumstance that I had previously under a social engineering loss, where the CFO received an email, looked to be from a true vendor, and it was actually for a true amount due. It was for a delivery that had occurred. The amount was correct. The email address was correct. It came through. The CFO received it, quickly sent it over to his accounting department and said, we need to pay this on a rush basis. The accounting department receives that from the CFO and says, this is what happened. They say, well, they must have vended it already. Let's get it up, set it up, and get it out. Well, they get it out, and the money's gone. Because they don't realize that the funds are gone until they go through their books and records again. And in this case, it was after 2 weeks. 2 weeks. They did the due diligence on the books and records on the most recent wire transfers. The client called asking for the money again, and they realized that they were duped. Ultimately, the money was gone. It was someone purporting to be a vendor, a true business counterparty, and the internal procedures were probably not followed because it was coming from the CFO.
And look, I've seen scenarios where, in some lucky circumstances, when these things do play out, it gets caught early. Typically where a CFO will wire the funds, and maybe within the same day, the vendor is calling to look for an update on the funds that were, that should be coming. And it's then that it's discovered that, oh, we've been duped. And you can work with your bank to stop that wire from happening. But again, in most of these cases, the wires, they end up going through, and it's very hard to recoup those funds. So our entire discussion so far has really been about scary events, right? These really horrible things happening. And yes, there is insurance out there to protect against these events from happening. But I also want to talk specifically to what food and beverage companies can do to protect themselves, right? Let's imagine a world where insurance didn't exist. What loss control measures should food and beverage companies take to protect themselves from suffering, being a victim to these cyber crimes, right? One way of potentially doing that is to look at what underwriters request, right, during the application process. We find ourselves in very harsh conditions because of the uptick in losses, the frequency of losses, but also the severity of losses. So underwriters are asking more and more questions about loss control. So can you just give some insight to the audience about those loss control measures, or even just, if you have an application handy, read off some of the requirements that underwriters have before they will get on risk?
No, absolutely, and they are looking for that information, because let's face it, I've had carriers, they write the account for 5 years, no problems, no claims, but all of a sudden now, because of the uptick in ransomware activity, they want additional supplemental applications. They want to make sure that best practices are being used. A couple examples, I have one up here from an insurance carrier. They want to make sure that frequent tested backups are in place. They want to make sure if you're backing up to a cloud platform or a local backup, if it's local, are you doing that offline? Is it air gapped? They want to make sure that there's regular updates to systems and software. Employee training. I mean, we talked about the cartoon earlier with, Dave. Again, I'm sorry, Dave, but, they want to make sure that employees are being trained, that companies are going through phishing exercises, so that, to the extent that you have employees that fail these exercises, you could train them. You could spend the time to go through what to look out for, how to hover over a link and look for the S on the end of an HTTPS to make sure that it's a secure link. Little items that you can, steps that you could take as an employee They want to make sure that that training is taking place. Another key component in today's day and age that underwriters are looking for is what's referred to as, remote access and multi-factor authentication. We talked about earlier, a lot of companies are now set up to have their employees work remotely. They want to make sure that, you're not just going in and entering, a database or an online portal and you can access your systems. They want to make sure, whether it be Citrix or, multi-factor authentication, Google Authenticator, there's dual authentication and you're not able to access your systems unless you do both steps. It's simple things like that that are being instituted by these companies that insurance carriers are looking for.
So Matt, as you know from all of our discussions related to food and beverage companies, we are dealing in a market segment where most companies are running on very thin margins, right? So whatever they purchase, right, whatever service they obtain from service providers, I always find that food and beverage clients are looking for the value add, right? So when they're looking at insurance, yes, there's financial protection in the form of limits, but they're always saying, how else can this insurance policy help me, help my company become better? So I think it's really important if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the value add when it comes to these cyber liability policies and what buyers need to recognize, in addition to just the financial protection that they're gaining when they do purchase one of these policies.
Yeah, that's a great question. These policies do protect you from a liability standpoint, right? But one of the key components of a cyber policy, and the way I talk about cyber policies, is not from a liability standpoint. It's from a value add, a service provider standpoint. Because let's face it, you have a ransomware demand that comes in on a Friday afternoon, you're going to scramble. If you don't have an insurance policy in place, you're going to scramble to find out, okay, who do I have to get in here? What vendors do I have to get in here to inform me about notification requirements? There's 48 different state requirements out there. I got to get a forensic analysis firm in here to figure out, okay, what's going on? How are they in my system? And how do I mitigate any further damage? I might have to get a public relations department in here to get the message out there to mitigate my exposure from a reputational standpoint. Credit monitoring, all these things, these are all value add services that are built into a cyber policy on a turnkey basis.
It's very similar to what we see with product contamination, product recall insurance. When companies are considering that coverage, there's more than just the financial damage, right? The value of contaminated products, the expenses to recall product out of the marketplace, the freight, the labor, the testing expenses, the destruction costs, right? But then there's the element of the crisis response, the crisis management. Hey, who do I need to have on my side to give me good guidance related to food safety exposures and food recalls? And that's where these insurance policies really come in a big way. They're providing these crisis response services. So yeah, I think this is a very valuable thing for buyers to understand when it comes to cyber liability, that they have access to these experts who can help guide them through a terrible situation.
No, without a doubt. And the thing to remember when you're buying this turnkey solution is that, these are pre-negotiated rates. These vendors that are used by insurance carriers, these are top of the line, top class business vendors, forensic analysis firms. If you were trying to go out after the breach happened and try to negotiate your pricing for someone to respond and help you, think about it. You're at a disadvantage. So having that cyber policy in place is, even if you end up not having to use it, you get someone in there quick enough, who to call, you pick up the phone. These people are responding instantaneously. That's their job. They have dedicated hotlines to be able to respond in a ransomware event or any sort of cyber attack event. So I view it as the value add services far outweigh the potential liability suits. Now, those can happen, don't get me wrong, but when you have both combined together, it's a win-win in my opinion.
So Matt, we've been talking about a lot of heavy topics, but now I want to kind of shift to a lighter side. In preparation for this call, I asked you a very, very important question. Remember, the name of this podcast is Food for Thought. So I always like to kind of dig in with my guests and ask them what their favorite food is. So for our audience, can you please tell everyone what your favorite food item what was the answer that you provided me?
And my answer was stuffed shells, without a doubt. I mean, that is my bread and butter right there. I wish I could eat them every day.
All right. So stuffed shells, I really thought about this and I was like, how am I going to get this guy something related to stuffed shells as a thank you for being a guest on Food for Thought? And I turned to who I would say is the OG of home delivery, grocery home delivery, and that is Fresh Direct. And we have a clip of Fresh Direct actually getting you some wonderful stuffed shells for you to enjoy.
Oh, that's great.
So I just want to thank Fresh Direct for what they did to help fulfill this stuffed shells gift for Matt. So Matt, tell us, how were the stuffed shells?
I'll tell you, my wife and kids, you can see the pictures behind me. I think they're going to want me to do this Food for Thought every day. So,
all right, that's great. And again, thanks to Fresh Direct for helping us out with this gift.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being a guest on Food for Thought. We covered a lot of ground. But I just thank you for your time, your expertise in this space. And who knows, maybe we'll have you back on for a future follow-up edition of Food for Thought, and we'll get you some more stuffed shells.
That will be great. And Michael, I greatly appreciate the time, and thank you.
Thanks to everyone who joined us today for Food for Thought. A special thanks to my guest, Matthew Sabino, and his team at ARC Excess and Surplus. And a very special thank you to the team over at Fresh Direct for delivering a unique gift, stuffed shells, to our guest. Learn more about Fresh Direct and all of their offerings beyond just stuffed shells by visiting their website at freshdirect.com. To continue the conversation on cyber risk solutions, please reach out to me personally by phone or email. I look forward to hearing from you. And finally, thank you to all of our Foa and Son valued clients for your continued trust in allowing us to handle your risk management and insurance needs. I'll see you next time on Foa and Son's Food for Thought. All right, well, hey, thanks everyone. Matt, thank you so much for all the time and energy you put into this. We don't pay you the big bucks for doing this, but at least we get you stuffed shells.
Absolutely. And they were great, like I said.
I think you said they were the best stuffed shells you've ever had.
My wife was actually very upset about that because she couldn't deny it either. So.
All right. Well, look, let's jump into the Q&A. I want to be sensitive of everyone's time and appreciate everyone who joined us today. I see that, Patty, we have a few questions that came in.
Yeah. So the first question is a little bit about, we think that cyber insurance is really meant for if you have PII or healthcare information. So what if my company doesn't have those kind of exposures? How would a policy respond about one of these breaches if I'm not storing PII or healthcare data?
Yeah, I mean that's Matt. That's a great question. I think you can probably handle that one. I mean that's been the old mindset around cyber liability and cyber risk policies. But I believe that every company does have an exposure. So Matt, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. It is a great question because historically speaking, people think about it from the standpoint of, I'm a financial corporation, I'm a healthcare institution that has a lot of this sensitive information that ultimately could lead to liability suits. And that is still the case. Don't get me wrong. But, as we talked about on this webcast, is, there's other elements of cyber insurance, the cyber extortion component of the coverage. It doesn't matter, if there's, PII or healthcare information that, these criminals can lock down or potentially use or expose. Companies can be shut down from a business interruption standpoint. And ultimately, revenue is not being generated when you're down. And a lot of times these malicious actors, these financial institutions and healthcare institutions have top of the line kind of firewalls to protect themselves, where a manufacturing company or a food distributor may not have the same scope and scale, so their systems could be potentially more exposed. So I think that in today's day and age, you can't just think about it from a PII or healthcare standpoint. You have to look at it from protecting your business first and foremost.
Nailed it.
Great, thanks, Matt. So, all right, I have BI coverage under my commercial property policy. Why do I have to also get BI under a cyber policy?
All right, so BI, this is a very, very good question, and it's one that I field quite often. A good example of this would be what we see with COVID-19 related business interruption losses. There may be better examples out there, but this is what comes to mind. A lot of companies are searching for business interruption coverage due to what they've suffered because of COVID-19. And in all of these cases, what we're seeing is insurance companies push back on the fact that the coverage trigger under business interruption has not triggered. Most business interruption coverage is found under a commercial property policy. To trigger business interruption, there typically has to be physical damage to property that's insured under that policy. So in most of these cyber situations, while yes, companies are suffering the business interruption, the business interruption is not the type of event that triggers coverage under a commercial property policy. So yes, don't be fooled by the fact that you have quote unquote business interruption insurance under your commercial property policy, because that coverage does not trigger for every type of potential business interruption that you could suffer, one of those areas specifically being some type of cyber breach. So Matt, anything you want to add to that?
No, that's a great point, Michael, and you hit the nail on the head. When you think about the commercial business interruption coverage that's afforded, it's not stemming from a malicious cyber act, which is what the cyber business interruption is really geared more towards. Think about the Mondelez scenario, the ransomware scenario, and the business interruption, them being down. The carriers a lot in that situation relied upon cyber exclusion, exclusions applicable to war. A lot of these cyber policies now have a card back for acts of cyber terrorism. So just thinking about that in a real world type of situation where a cyber policy, the business interruption that could stem from a malicious event, a ransomware event, there's going to be a gap if you don't have the coverage in place from a cyber standpoint.
Patty, any other questions that came through?
There is one more. So this anonymous attendee is asking, so their IT systems are supported by outside vendors and service providers. So how is my cyber policy going to cover me if I'm using outside vendors and services?
Another great question, because you think about it, hey, this policy is intended to cover me and it's my computer systems. Well, a lot of these, I'd say 99.9% of these policies, and if it doesn't have it in your policy, please call us. They expand definitions of computer systems to incorporate, your outside, outsourced service providers from an IT or computer standpoint. There's things coverage such as contingent business interruption, where let's just say that your IT provider has a system down from a business interruption standpoint, and now you suffer a financial loss because of that, and because you rely upon their systems. There's coverage components in a cyber liability policy that speak to that exposure. So again, don't just think about it from the standpoint of your computer systems, but to the extent that you're outsourcing any of that work or relying upon outside service providers from a computer and IT standpoint, there are protections built into cyber policies that will speak to that.
All right. So I think that unless anything else came in, I think that completes the questions that did come through. Thanks to those for asking the questions. Much appreciated. It's always nice to have that anonymous option, right? When posing a question, people don't want to air their dirty laundry. But anyhow, thanks to everyone who joined today. Matt, special thank you to you for being our guest on this episode of Food for Thought. Patty
Absolutely.
Devine, thank you so much for all the work that you've put into producing these Food for Thoughts. Couldn't do it without you. And please, for those out there, go to foaandson.com, learn more about us, learn more about future Food for Thought episodes. And again, if you have any suggestions for future content, please reach out, let us know, and we'll look to do a future Food for Thought episode on that content. So again, thanks to all, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.